Ethan Cole had seen war before. He had seen the destruction it left behind, the bodies, the ruins, the silence that followed when the last shot was fired. But this was different. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't a battlefield he understood. This was Xal'Vira, a world known for its hostility towards humans, a world where he had just crash-landed. His ship, barely holding together after an unexpected attack from an unknown force, now lay in a twisted heap of metal and smoke. The air around him was thick with the scent of burning circuits, and the sky above was painted in the eerie glow of Xal'Vira's twin moons. He groaned, pushing himself off the ground, every muscle in his body protesting. His suit's emergency systems blinked in red warnings, his oxygen levels dangerously low. He had to move. The dense jungle around him pulsed with life, alien creatures slithering through the shadows, their glowing eyes watching from the darkness. Ethan had read about Xal'Vira. He had studied its terrain, its people, its dangers. But no amount of research could have prepared him for this, being stranded, alone, on a planet where humans were despised. He reached for his sidearm, the only weapon he had left. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then he heard them. Heavy footsteps. Not just one, but many. The ground trembled slightly as figures emerged from the shadows, tall and armored, their sharp, curved weapons glinting under the alien moonlight. Xal'Virian warriors, and leading them was someone who made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. Commander Xal'Vira. He had seen her image before, in military files, in reports of past skirmishes between humans and Xal'Virians. She was a legend among her kind, a warrior feared across the galaxy. Her armor was jet black with streaks of glowing silver, her long violet hair flowing behind her like a storm. Her piercing amber eyes locked onto him, filled with nothing but hatred. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The warriors around her stood tense, their weapons raised, ready to strike at her command. Ethan slowly lifted his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. Not yet, at least. But Xal'Vira didn't seem interested in negotiations. A human, she said, her voice laced with disgust, crawling through the dirt like a wounded animal. Ethan clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He knew anything he said would only make things worse. Xal'Virians didn't take prisoners. If they didn't kill him immediately, it only meant something worse was coming. She took a step closer, tilting her head slightly, studying him as if he were nothing more than a curiosity. "You're not afraid." Ethan met her gaze. "Would it change anything if I was?" A flicker of something passed through her eyes, gone just as quickly as it came. Then, without warning, she moved. Before he could react, she slammed the back of her gauntleted hand against his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his ribs as he gasped for air, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The warriors around them laughed, but Xal'Vira remained emotionless. She loomed over him, her shadow swallowing him whole. "You are weak," she said, "like all your kind." Ethan coughed, forcing himself up onto his elbows, his vision spinning. "Then why are you wasting time talking to me?" That made her pause. The warriors grew silent, as if waiting to see what she would do. Ethan wasn't sure why he had said that. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was sheer stupidity. But he wasn't going to beg. If this was where he died, then so be it. Xal'Vira stared at him for a long moment before she let out a slow breath. "Kill him," she ordered. The warriors surged forward. Ethan didn't have time to think. His instincts took over. He rolled to the side just as a blade came down where his head had been, the weapon slicing through the ground like butter. He grabbed a fistful of dirt and threw it into the nearest warrior's face, using the distraction to push himself to his feet. His ribs screamed in protest, but he forced himself to move. He needed a plan. But there was no plan, no escape. A sharp pain exploded in the back of his head. The world tilted. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Xal'Vira's cold, unyielding gaze. Then everything went black. Pain. That was the first thing Ethan felt when he woke. a deep, throbbing ache at the base of his skull, spreading through his body like fire. His arms were stiff, his wrists bound tightly behind him with something rough and unyielding. He groaned, blinking against the dim light filtering through the cracks in the metal walls around him. It took a moment for his senses to adjust, for the fog in his mind to clear. He was in a cell. The walls were cold, made from a dark metallic alloy that hummed faintly with energy. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, something chemical, almost sterile. He forced himself upright, his movements slow and careful. His head still swam from the blow he had taken. They must have dragged him here after knocking him unconscious. His boots scraped against the rough floor as he tried to shift, testing the restraints around his wrists. No give. He had been captured before, on missions gone wrong, in battles where he had been outnumbered. But this was different. This wasn't human captivity. This was Xal'Virian imprisonment, and from what he knew, very few humans lived long enough to tell the story. A presence loomed outside the cell. Ethan glanced up just as the heavy door slid open with a low hiss. Commander Xal'Vira stepped inside, flanked by 2 armed warriors. She moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of battle, her sharp golden eyes locking onto him as if she were sizing up a prey that wasn't worth the hunt. In her hand, she carried a sleek, curved blade, the metal gleaming under the faint light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she took a slow step forward. "You're awake." Ethan smirked despite himself. "Yeah, well, getting hit in the head tends to do that." One of the warriors snarled and moved to strike him, but Xal'Vira lifted a hand, stopping them. Her gaze remained fixed on Ethan, unreadable. Most humans beg when they wake up in a Xal'Virian cell. They cry. They plead for their lives. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall, exhaling slowly. "That's supposed to scare me." She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she sheathed her blade, stepping closer. "Tell me, human, what were you doing on Xal'Vira?" Ethan rolled his shoulders, feeling the tightness in his muscles. "Diplomatic mission." She laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Humans don't come to Xal'Vira for diplomacy. They come to take, to conquer, just like they did before." Ethan met her gaze. "Not all humans." Xal'Vira's expression darkened. "All humans," she corrected. "Your people invaded our colonies, took our lands, and now you expect me to believe you came here in peace." Ethan let out a slow breath. He knew the history. The war between humanity and Xal'Vira had been brutal, but it wasn't a war he had fought. He had been a soldier, yes, but not in that war. He had lost people too. And yet to her, he was just another enemy, another human to despise. "Believe whatever you want," he said finally. "It won't change the fact that I had nothing to do with that war." Xal'Vira narrowed her eyes but said nothing. Instead, she turned sharply and gestured to her warriors. "Take him to the pits." Ethan frowned. "The pits." She smirked, a dangerous gleam in her eyes. "Let's see if you really are as strong as you pretend to be." The warriors grabbed him roughly, hauling him to his feet. Ethan barely had time to steady himself before they shoved him forward, forcing him out of the cell and down a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls vibrated slightly, as if the whole structure was alive. He kept his breathing steady, forcing himself to focus. Wherever they were taking him, it wasn't good. Minutes later, he found himself standing at the edge of a massive underground cavern, illuminated by eerie green lights embedded in the rock. The air was thick with heat, and the ground beneath his feet rumbled faintly. He could hear the sound of something moving. Something large. At the center of the cavern was a pit, deep and wide, lined with jagged stone. Inside, the shadows twisted and shifted, but Ethan could see the faintest glint of movement. Claws, scales, something alive. Xal'Vira stepped beside him, arms crossed. "This is where we test warriors." Ethan exhaled. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" She nodded to the pit. "Survive." Before he could react, the warriors shoved him forward. He stumbled, barely managing to keep his balance as he tumbled into the pit below. The ground was uneven, loose gravel sliding beneath his boots. He turned just in time to see Xal'Vira watching from above, her gaze unreadable. Then, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. Ethan's heart pounded. He turned slowly, his breath catching as the creature slithered out of the darkness. It was massive, reptilian in form, with thick, armored scales that shimmered under the dim light. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its tail lashed behind it, sending dust flying into the air. He had no weapons, no armor, just his instincts. The creature lunged. Ethan dodged to the side, barely avoiding the massive claws that slammed into the ground where he had stood. He rolled, grabbing a loose rock and hurling it at the beast's head. It barely flinched. He was going to have to be smarter than this. The creature snarled, circling him, its forked tongue flickering in the air. It was studying him, just like he was studying it. He crouched, waiting. If he ran, he would die. If he hesitated, he would die. The only way out was forward. The beast lunged again. But this time, Ethan was ready. He dove low, slipping beneath its massive bulk, and slammed his elbow into the softer flesh beneath its jaw. The creature recoiled, letting out an angry screech. From above, he could hear the murmur of Xal'Virian warriors watching. He didn't look up, but he could feel Xal'Vira's gaze burning into him. She had thrown him in here to prove a point, to show him that he was weak, that humans were nothing but prey. But he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. The creature reared back for another strike, and this time, Ethan acted first. He darted forward, grabbing onto a jagged rock jutting from the ground. As the beast lunged, he used the rock as leverage, vaulting himself up and over its head. Landing on its back, he wrapped his arms around its thick neck and squeezed. The creature thrashed violently, trying to shake him off. But Ethan held on, gritting his teeth as the beast slammed against the pit walls, desperate to throw him loose. He could feel its muscles straining beneath him, the pulse of its heartbeat pounding in rhythm with his own. With a final, powerful jerk, the creature let out a shuddering breath and collapsed, its body going still. Silence filled the cavern. Ethan rolled off its back, breathing hard. He looked up at Xal'Vira. She stared down at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't as weak as she had thought. Ethan sat in the corner of his cell, his muscles aching from the brutal fight in the pit. His knuckles were raw, his ribs bruised, but he was still breathing. That had to count for something. The Xal'Virian guards had dragged him back here after the beast had collapsed beneath him, whispering among themselves as if they couldn't believe what they had seen. A human surviving the trial. He could almost hear their disbelief. The door to his cell hissed open. He didn't look up. He knew who it was. Xal'Vira stepped inside, her presence commanding even in the dim light. She didn't speak right away, simply watching him, studying him as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. Ethan kept his expression neutral, waiting. Finally, she spoke. No human has ever survived the pits. Ethan let out a slow breath. Guess I'm full of surprises. She took a step closer, her boots barely making a sound against the cold floor. You could have died. But I didn't, he countered, forcing himself to meet her gaze. Something flickered in her golden eyes, something unreadable. Then she turned sharply. Get up. Ethan hesitated, then pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting every movement. He wasn't sure if she was here to kill him, or if there was something else at play. He had seen the way the Xal'Virian warriors looked at him after the fight, less like a prisoner, more like something worth watching. Xal'Vira gestured for him to follow, and he did, stepping out of the cell and into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The guards flanking the hall stood tense as he passed, their hands hovering over their weapons. No doubt they were waiting for him to make a wrong move. He didn't give them the satisfaction. She led him through a winding maze of stone and metal, the fortress carved into the very bones of the planet. Every step echoed with a quiet power, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of history. Then, finally, they emerged into a massive chamber, a command hall lined with battle-worn warriors. At the center of the room, a holographic display flickered to life, showing a planet-wide map of Xal'Vira. But it wasn't Xal'Virians moving across the battlefield. It was something else. Ethan frowned. Who are they? Xal'Vira's jaw tightened. Dralgons. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had heard whispers of the Dralgons before, but nothing concrete. A war-hungry species, feared even by the most dangerous civilizations. They didn't conquer planets. They consumed them. Xal'Vira crossed her arms, her tone sharp. They attacked one of our outposts last night. They are moving fast, slaughtering my warriors. And She paused, as if the words burned in her throat. Then she exhaled. I need information on their battle tactics. Ethan arched an eyebrow. And you think I have that? She turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. You fought them before, didn't you? Ethan hesitated. He had. Once. A classified mission that had ended in disaster. The Dralgons were ruthless, their strategy unlike anything humanity had faced before. They didn't just fight wars. They studied their enemies, adapting, evolving. A single mistake could mean the end of an entire civilization. I know a little, he admitted, but it won't be enough. Xal'Vira's gaze hardened. Then we fight together. The room fell silent. Even her own warriors looked at her in shock, some shifting uncomfortably, others gripping their weapons as if the mere thought of an alliance with a human was enough to make their blood boil. Ethan let out a low laugh, shaking his head. You hate humans. You made that very clear. Why trust me now? Her expression remained unreadable, but there was something different in her gaze now, something almost reluctant. Because I hate the Dralgons more. Ethan considered her for a long moment. He wasn't a fool. He knew this was dangerous. She could kill him the moment she got what she wanted. But the Dralgons were a far greater threat, and if they weren't stopped, Xal'Vira would burn. And so would everything else. Finally, he nodded. All right. But if we do this, we do it my way. A flicker of amusement crossed her face. You're in no position to give orders, human. He smirked. Then why are you listening? Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned toward the holographic map, gesturing for him to step forward. Ethan studied the battlefield. The Dralgons weren't attacking randomly. They were moving in coordinated waves, targeting key Xal'Virian strongholds. If they weren't stopped now, the entire planet would fall within days. He pointed at one of the outposts near the mountains. This is their next target. Xal'Vira narrowed her eyes. How do you know? Because that's exactly what I would do, he said. For the first time since meeting her, he saw something shift in her gaze. Not hatred, not anger, something else. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see him as something more than an enemy. The night sky over Xal'Vira was restless, filled with the distant hum of battle cruisers cutting through the atmosphere, their metallic silhouettes blending into the dark. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that pressed down on a soldier's chest before a fight. Ethan stood on the rocky ridge overlooking the war-torn landscape below, his eyes scanning the horizon, where the Dralgon's forces had begun to gather. He had been in plenty of battles before, but this time was different. This time, he was fighting alongside people who would rather see him dead. Behind him, the Xal'Virian warriors were preparing for battle, sharpening their weapons, testing their armor, exchanging murmured words in their guttural language. They barely acknowledged him, though their distrust was obvious in the stiff way they moved around him. He wasn't one of them. He was still an outsider, still human. And yet, here he was, standing beside them against an enemy that didn't care who they were, only that they were in the way. A familiar presence approached. Xal'Vira. She was dressed in full battle armor now, the dark plates etched with Xal'Virian war markings, her twin swords sheathed at her back. She stood beside him without speaking at first, her golden eyes locked on the valley below where the Dralgon forces lurked. The flickering fires of their encampments cast long shadows against the jagged rock formations, the eerie glow making them look almost ghostly. "You were right," she finally said, her voice quieter than usual. "They are coming for the mountain outpost." Ethan nodded. "It's a strategic move. The high ground gives them an advantage, and once they control it, they can push deeper into your territory. If we don't stop them here, Xal'Vira falls." She turned her gaze on him, studying him the way she always did, as if trying to see past the surface to something deeper. "And you still fight, even though you have no reason to." He let out a slow breath. "I have a reason." She raised a brow. "Which is?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment. "Because no one else should have to go through what I did when they attacked my world." Xal'Vira's expression shifted ever so slightly, but she didn't press further. Instead, she gestured toward the warriors behind them. "They do not trust you." "I noticed," he said dryly. She smirked. "You don't blame them." "No," Ethan admitted. "I wouldn't trust me either if I were in their position." She exhaled through her nose, glancing back at her people. "They are watching, waiting to see if you prove them wrong." Ethan met her gaze. "And you?" Xal'Vira was silent for a long moment before she said, "I am still deciding." Before he could respond, the sound of distant explosions shattered the air. The Dralgons had begun their assault. Ethan turned, gripping the rifle one of the Xal'Virian warriors had reluctantly handed him earlier. Down below, the enemy forces were already advancing, their monstrous figures moving with terrifying precision. The Dralgons weren't just soldiers. They were predators. Their armor was thick, their weapons brutal, their sheer numbers overwhelming. The Xal'Virians braced for impact, warriors tightening their grips on their blades, their expressions hardening with battle readiness. They fought differently than humans, closer, more lethal, like a dance of death perfected over centuries. But even they had to recognize that this fight would not be won through brute force alone. Ethan stepped forward. "We need to control their approach," he called out. Some of the warriors barely spared him a glance, but others hesitated, listening. "They rely on overwhelming force, but they're not invincible. We need to funnel them into tighter corridors, limit their movement. If they can't spread out, they can't surround us." Xal'Vira nodded sharply. "He's right." That caught their attention. She turned to her warriors, her voice carrying authority. "Fall back to the second ridge. Force them through the narrow pass. We make our stand there." The warriors obeyed without question, moving into formation. Ethan followed, his heart hammering. This was happening. He was standing beside the very people who had once called him an enemy, fighting alongside them against something far worse. The Dralgons surged forward, their battle cries cutting through the night. The first wave clashed against the Xal'Virian defenses with terrifying force. Blades met armor, plasma fire lit up the darkness, and the air filled with the sounds of war. Ethan moved without hesitation. He fired into the oncoming wave, taking down 2, 3 Dralgons before ducking behind cover as return fire scorched the rock beside him. The Xal'Virians fought with deadly precision, their movements almost elegant as they weaved through the enemy lines, cutting down anything in their path. Xal'Vira was at the front, her twin blades a blur as she carved through the enemy with ruthless efficiency. She moved like a force of nature, her strikes precise, her expression unreadable. Ethan had seen skilled fighters before, but nothing like this. A Dralgon warrior lunged toward him, its jagged weapon slicing through the air. Ethan barely managed to roll out of the way, coming up just in time to fire a shot point blank into the creature's chest. It fell with a guttural snarl, but more were coming. They didn't stop. They never stopped. The battle raged on, the tide shifting back and forth. Ethan lost track of time, his body moving on instinct, dodging, striking, surviving. Blood both human and alien, coated the ground. Explosions rocked the mountainside. The very earth seemed to tremble beneath the weight of the conflict. Then, suddenly, he heard her scream. He turned just in time to see Xal'Vira go down. A Dralgon had gotten past her defenses, its blade slicing deep into her side. She staggered, her breath hitching, and in that split second, Ethan moved. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He ran. The Dralgon raised its weapon for the final strike, but before it could land the blow, Ethan slammed into it from behind, driving his blade into the gap in its armor. The creature let out a strangled roar before collapsing, its blood pooling beneath it. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Xal'Vira, his hands already pressing against the wound at her side. "Stay with me," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Her golden eyes met his, clouded with pain, but still burning with defiance. You saved me." "You sound surprised," he muttered, trying to keep pressure on the wound. Her lips parted as if to say something, but before she could, the battle around them roared to life once more. More Dralgons were coming, their forces pushing harder, and the Xal'Virians were starting to fall back. Ethan's mind raced. If they didn't end this soon, they would all be dead. Then he saw it, a weak point in the enemy's formation. A chance, but it would take both of them. He looked down at Xal'Vira. "Can you still fight?" She gritted her teeth, forcing herself up despite the pain. "Always." Ethan smirked. "Then let's end this." Together, they turned to face the oncoming enemy, standing side by side. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for her. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Ethan stood at the edge of the battlefield, his breath still ragged from the fight. The bodies of Dralgon warriors lay scattered across the ground, their dark blood staining the rocky terrain. Smoke curled into the night air, the scent of burning metal and scorched earth thick in his lungs. His hands were slick with sweat, his fingers still clenched around the hilt of his blade. Beside him, Xal'Vira remained standing, though barely. Blood seeped through the cracks in her armor, dripping from the wound in her side. She held herself with that same unshakable pride, but he could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her breathing was uneven. She was hurt worse than she let on. Ethan turned to her. "We need to get you out of here." She gave him a sharp look, as if the mere suggestion offended her. "I am not weak." "Never said you were," he replied, his voice steady. "But you're not invincible either." Before she could argue, a sound echoed through the night, the sharp clang of approaching footsteps. Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened as a group of Xal'Virian warriors emerged from the shadows, their armor still gleaming with the aftermath of battle. But something was off. They weren't here to celebrate a victory. Xal'Vira straightened despite her injuries, her golden eyes narrowing as the lead warrior stepped forward. Ethan recognized him, General Kareth, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Xal'Virian military. His presence was heavy, his gaze filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Kareth's eyes flicked between them before landing on Xal'Vira. "Commander," he said, his tone sharp, "you have disgraced yourself." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had expected some resistance, maybe even hostility. But this... Xal'Vira's expression didn't waver. "I fought for our people," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We won this battle. Xal'Vira still stands." Kareth's lip curled. "You fought with a human." The weight of those words hung in the air. The other warriors behind Kareth stood rigid, their hands gripping their weapons, their faces dark with something Ethan recognized. Betrayal. Ethan stepped forward. "Without me, you wouldn't have won," he said evenly. The warriors bristled at his words, but Kareth didn't even look at him. His focus remained on Xal'Vira. "You have tainted your bloodline with this disgrace," he said coldly. "You have allowed a human to fight beside you, to stand at your side as if he were one of us. Do you deny this?" Xal'Vira didn't flinch. "I deny nothing. Ethan saved my life. He saved Xal'Virian lives. That is the only truth that matters. Kareth's expression hardened. Then you are a traitor. The words struck harder than any blade. The warriors behind him began to move, forming a loose circle around them. Ethan's muscles tensed, his instincts screaming at him to act, but Xal'Vira held up a hand, stopping him. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. You would turn against your own. Kareth's gaze darkened. You turned against us first. Ethan knew where this was going before Kareth even spoke the next words. Seize her. Everything happened in an instant. The warriors lunged, their movements precise and ruthless. Xal'Vira fought, but she was wounded, and they knew it. Ethan moved without thinking, knocking one of them aside before another slammed into him, sending him crashing to the ground. He barely had time to react before a heavy boot pressed against his chest, pinning him down. He struggled, but more hands grabbed him, forcing his arms behind his back. Xal'Vira was fighting tooth and nail, but she was outnumbered, her body betraying her wounds. Kareth watched impassively as his warriors finally overpowered her, forcing her to her knees. Ethan felt a sharp pressure against his throat as a blade was pressed against his skin. Kareth stepped closer, looking down at him with cold indifference. You should have died in the pit, he said simply. It would have been a more honorable death than this. Ethan didn't answer. His mind was racing, searching for a way out. He had faced death before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just his life on the line. Xal'Vira turned her head, her gaze locking onto him. There was no fear in her expression, only resolve. Kareth finally looked at her. You will be executed for treason, he said, his voice final. And the human will die with you. The words should have made Ethan panic, but instead, something inside him burned with defiance. No, Xal'Vira said suddenly. Kareth frowned. What? You will not kill him, she said, her voice like steel. Because if you do, you will prove that you are no better than the Dralgons we just fought. Murmurs rippled through the gathered warriors. Kareth's expression darkened. You dare compare us to them? She lifted her chin, even as she remained on her knees. They kill without reason. They destroy without honor. But if you execute one of the only people who fought to save this planet, then tell me, how are you different? Silence. The weight of her words settled over the gathered warriors like a heavy storm. Even those who had been eager to strike hesitated now, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Ethan watched, his pulse steady, his mind working. Kareth's lips pressed into a thin line. You speak well, Xal'Vira, he said at last. But words do not erase actions. He gestured to his warriors. Take them both, he ordered. They will face judgment at dawn. Ethan barely had time to process the words before he was yanked to his feet, the blade at his throat disappearing only to be replaced by heavy shackles around his wrists. Xal'Vira was restrained beside him, her breathing uneven, her golden eyes still burning with defiance. As they were dragged away, Ethan turned to her. I didn't think you were the giving speeches type, he muttered. She exhaled through her nose, a ghost of a smirk playing at her lips despite everything. Neither did I. They were being taken to their deaths. And yet, as Ethan walked beside her, bound and beaten, he found himself gripping onto something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The Xyphorian prison was carved deep into the heart of the mountain, its walls made of dark, pulsating stone that seemed to hum with an eerie energy. Ethan had no idea if it was some kind of living material or just a byproduct of the alien architecture, but either way, it made the place feel more like a tomb than a cell. The air was thick with the scent of damp rock and something metallic. Blood, maybe. He sat against the cold wall, his wrists still bound with energy restraints that pulsed with a faint blue light. Xal'Vira was beside him, her armor cracked, her face bruised, but her pride still untouched. They had been thrown here without a word, their fate already decided. At dawn, they would be executed. Ethan had been in bad situations before. He had been captured, outnumbered, thrown into impossible odds. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He glanced at Xal'Vira, who sat with her back straight, her golden eyes unreadable as she stared at the iron door across from them. "You still think they'll listen to reason?" he asked, breaking the silence. She didn't look at him. "They have already made their decision." Ethan exhaled sharply. "That's reassuring." Xal'Vira finally turned her head, studying him. "I did not ask you to save me in battle." He smirked. "Yeah, well, I have a bad habit of not letting people die when I can do something about it." A flicker of something passed through her gaze, something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't gratitude either. She looked away, her jaw tightening. "I was raised to believe humans were weak," she murmured, almost to herself. "That they were cowards who only fought when they had no choice." Ethan leaned his head back against the wall. "And now?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Now, I am questioning everything." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Welcome to my world." Before she could respond, the heavy iron door groaned open, and a figure stepped inside. Kareth. The general stood tall, his expression impassive as he looked down at them. The torchlight from the hallway flickered across his battle-worn face, casting sharp shadows along the ridges of his armor. "You should not be alive," he said simply, addressing Ethan. Ethan arched a brow. "That's what a lot of people say." Kareth ignored the remark. "I have come to offer you both a choice." Xal'Vira lifted her chin. "We do not need your mercy." Kareth's gaze hardened. "It is not mercy." He crossed his arms. "The Dralgons are regrouping. Even with your victory in the mountain pass, they are not defeated. They are coming again, and this time, they will bring their full force." Ethan frowned. "And this concerns us because—" Kareth's eyes flicked to Xal'Vira. "Because I will not execute our best warrior when Sephoria still needs her." The tension in the room thickened. Xal'Vira's expression remained unreadable. "You wish for me to fight, after condemning me as a traitor." Kareth exhaled. "I do not trust you, but I trust your skill. You fight, and I will grant you your life." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "And me?" Kareth's gaze turned colder. "You are a human. You mean nothing to me." Xal'Vira's shoulders tensed slightly, but she remained silent. Ethan let out a breath, shaking his head. "Right. Should have guessed." Kareth turned his attention back to Xal'Vira. "Make your choice." For the first time, hesitation flickered across her features. Ethan saw it, the moment she realized what this meant. She could live, but only if she let them kill him. Only if she walked away from everything they had fought for together. She looked at him. Ethan didn't say anything. He just held her gaze, waiting. Then, finally, she spoke. "I will fight," she said. Kareth's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He turned to leave. "But," Xal'Vira added, her voice sharper, "Ethan fights with me." Kareth froze mid-step. Slowly, he turned back to her, his expression dark. "You would stake your life on a human." Xal'Vira's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." The silence stretched unbearably long. Kareth's jaw clenched. "Then you are a fool." Xal'Vira tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps, but if you wish to win this war, you will need fools like me." Ethan fought the urge to smirk. She was playing him, pushing just enough to force his hand without outright defying him. Kareth studied her for a long time, then let out a slow breath. "Very well. The human fights." Without another word, he turned on his heel and left, the door slamming shut behind him. Ethan let out a low whistle. "You really do like making things difficult, don't you?" Xal'Vira exhaled, shaking her head. "I could say the same to you." Ethan shifted, stretching his arms as best he could in the restraints. "So, we're alive. For now." "For now," she agreed. Ethan looked at her, his expression serious. "You didn't have to do that." She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no hostility, no lingering resentment, just quiet understanding. "Yes," she said simply. "I did." For the first time since crash landing on Xal'Vira, Ethan felt something unexpected. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The battlefield stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of scorched metal and blood clinging to every breath. Ethan stood at the edge of the war zone, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his weapon. This was it, the final stand. The Dralgons had returned with overwhelming force, their dark, hulking war machines crawling across the Xal'Virian plains like monstrous insects. Their soldiers moved in disciplined waves, their armor reflecting the flickering fires of destruction they had left in their wake. The Xal'Virian forces stood ready, but even Ethan could see the fear in their eyes. This was no ordinary battle. This was a fight for survival. Beside him, Xal'Vira adjusted the grip on her twin blades. She had refused medical attention for her wounds, despite the deep gash in her side still seeping dark blood. She moved as if pain was an afterthought, her golden eyes locked onto the enemy with unwavering focus. Kareth stood at the front, issuing orders with the cold efficiency of a seasoned general. He had made it clear that Ethan was still an outsider, still a human, still unworthy of trust. But for now, survival was more important than grudges. Ethan glanced at Xal'Vira. "Last chance to change your mind. You could still walk away from this." She turned her head slightly, a ghost of a smirk crossing her lips, "and leave you to face them alone." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Didn't think so." A deep guttural roar split the air, and the Dralgons began their charge. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their assault. The Xal'Virian warriors let out their own battle cries, their voices merging into one defiant roar as they surged forward to meet the enemy head-on. Blades clashed against armor, plasma bolts streaked through the night, and the air filled with the deafening sounds of war. Ethan moved without hesitation. He ducked beneath the swing of a Dralgon's jagged blade, coming up with a quick slash of his own, the energy-infused edge of his weapon slicing through the creature's armor. It staggered back, snarling, but Ethan didn't give it a chance to recover. He drove his blade deep into its exposed throat, twisting as the body went limp. The Xal'Vira was a blur beside him, her movements precise, deadly. She spun through the battlefield like a storm, her twin swords flashing as she cut down enemy after enemy. Her breathing was labored, her whelm slowing her down, but she didn't falter. A Dralgon came at her from behind, its blade raised high. Ethan was faster. He lunged forward, tackling the creature before it could strike. The two of them hit the ground hard, rolling across the dirt. The Dralgon snarled, its claws raking against Ethan's arm, but he ignored the pain, forcing his knee into the creature's chest as he drove his blade through its skull. He pushed himself up, breathing hard, just in time to see Xal'Vira staring at him. "You're getting better at this," she said, wiping blood from her cheek. Learning from the best, he shot back. There was no time for more words. The battle raged on, and the Dralgons weren't slowing down. Ethan caught sight of something in the distance, a command tower, heavily guarded but standing as the central hub of the Dralgon assault. If they could take it down, they could cripple the enemy's coordination. He turned to Xal'Vira, pointing toward it. "That's our target." She followed his gaze, then nodded sharply. "Let's move." They fought their way through the battlefield, cutting down any Dralgons in their path. Ethan's arms ached, his body screamed in protest, but he pushed forward. Every step was a fight, every moment a struggle to survive. They'd reached the tower's base, ducking into the shadows as a squad of heavily armored Dralgons stood guard. Ethan exhaled. "This is going to be a problem." Xal'Vira's lips curled into a small, reckless grin. "Then let's make it their problem." Before he could stop her, she surged forward. Ethan cursed under his breath and followed. The fight was brutal. The Dralgon guards were larger, stronger, and well-trained. But Xal'Vira was faster. She moved like liquid fire, dodging strikes with effortless precision, her blades finding weak points in their armor. Ethan wasn't as elegant, But he was relentless. He blocked a strike, spun, and drove his blade into a Dralgon's exposed neck. Another lunged at him, but Xal'Vira was there, her sword slicing through its knee before Ethan finished it off with a clean strike. They moved together, instinct guiding them. Two warriors who had once been enemies, now fighting as one. The last guard fell, and they stormed the command tower. Inside, the Dralgon officers turned in surprise, their eyes widening in alarm. Xal'Vira didn't give them time to react. She tore through them with ruthless efficiency, cutting down anyone in her path. Ethan moved to the control panel, scanning it quickly. The Dralgon's systems were complex, but he didn't need to understand everything. He just needed to break them. His fingers flew across the controls, overriding security systems, setting off emergency lockdowns. Then he found what he was looking for. The power core. He hit the detonation sequence. "Time to go," he shouted. Xal'Vira turned, saw what he had done, and smirked. "You're learning." They sprinted out of the tower, cutting down the last few Dralgons in their way. The explosion rocked the battlefield. The command tower erupted in a fiery blast, sending debris raining down. The Dralgon forces hesitated, their coordination breaking. The Xiphorians seized the moment, pushing forward with renewed fury. The tide had turned. Ethan and Xal'Vira stood at the edge of the chaos, breathing hard, watching as the Dralgon army collapsed under the counterattack. It was over. The battlefield was littered with bodies, the sky clearing as the smoke began to fade. The Xiphorian warriors stood victorious, though many had fallen. Kareth approached, his expression unreadable. He looked at Xal'Vira. "You did what was necessary." Then, to Ethan, "And you." He studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "You have earned your place here." Ethan didn't need Kareth's approval, but he still felt something settle in his chest. Acceptance. As the Xiphorian warriors moved to reclaim their land, Ethan turned to Xal'Vira. "So," he said, exhaling, "what now?" She looked at him, her golden eyes softer than before. "Now we rebuild." He nodded, glancing at the sky. "And you?" She hesitated, then reached out, gripping his forearm in the traditional Xiphorian warrior's clasp. "You fight well, Ethan Cole. You are no longer just a human to me." Ethan smirked. "And you're not just an alien anymore." She tilted her head. "Then what am I?" He met her gaze, holding it. "Someone worth fighting for." For the first time, Xal'Vira smiled. And together, they stepped into a future neither of them had expected.